I'm not quite certain whether this is a direct response to Picasso, but this is something that addresses that kind of casual comment quite precisely. And what he said, I want to just take you through three kind of concepts in Chinese painting. If you take up traditional Chinese painting, the first is called 乘法, which is really a texturing method that's almost like a function of the brush. You know, you actually create different kinds of texture to indicate different kinds of physical realities. One particular thing that's quite extraordinary is that if you wanted to become a painter traditionally, you did not paint from the real scene, nor you actually didn't paint still life or a figure, but you learn it from a text. So this text, for the most prominent of these kind of texts, is called Manual of the Master Seed Garden. Everyone who's in that kind of training would know it. And Shubing said that he went through this, of course, and he said that I learned that 乘法 is a kind of writing. The second notion is the idea of 写生, which is writing an image, writing a scene. It's really literally writing. This is kind of a random Chinese painting that I pulled, and it doesn't really matter that it has to be this particular painting, but it really shows that if you pick up the texturing method that's kind of embodied in the function of the brush, and you begin to paint something like this, this is really kind of a writing a scenery. The third one is a very, very important notion of 如画, like painting. So when typically, like if you, in China, you look at the natural landscape and you say, this looks exactly like a painting. It is really a reflection of a long and very, very deep-rooted tradition of looking at some kind of scenery as writing. So that this particular case is a construct of in a garden that that's kind of designed and constructed to appear to be a painting, but with physical objects. Just kind of following this kind of three concepts, and when you look at a painting like that, and you begin to think that, is this a painting or is this a writing? Or you think about it, is this a garden or is this a writing? So I just show you kind of quickly a couple more images. They're not particularly, and some of them are quite historical, like these are the images from one of the most cherished cultural landscapes in China called Hangzhou West Lake. And those of you who have been there, and you understand how much of a history that's attached to that constructed landscape in this form or in this form. This is a bit of a jump. So if this is the case, how do we actually look at an experience like this? And some of you may recognize this is actually Shanghai Planning Museum, where you actually have a 360-degree kind of live show of a reconstructed Shanghai, which was experienced as some kind of past come now come future experience, timeless, but it's presented as somehow to me as a kind of enhanced image of Shanghai. What does this mean? So are we actually looking at something that is really started with writing and then kind of move to painting, move to construction of scenery, or move to actual construction. So this is really the kind of question that I would like to begin with, that a Chinese city is written. Do they write their cities? I will take this, and I have 3 sections. Apologize for being so kind of rigid with dividing the lectures, but I think it helps me to kind of articulate the idea. And the first one is really taking a step back and think about writing, and the idea that there has been long, like in dating back to prehistorical periods, a great divide between seeing language as sound and seeing language as image. This typically today in the discourse of structuralism, you see propositions like this. I took this particular page from Saussure not because of the text, but because of the diagram. Of course, the diagram was drawn by the editors of this book and not by himself, but it really is very telling that actually reflecting on Saussure's great emphasis on language being exclusively a topic of speech rather than writing. He just dismissed writing and really said that the Chinese writing was something else and not going to deal with it. And the study of language is the study of sound speech. No hands. I want to take this moment also to reflect a little bit more on something that's much, much larger, which is generally at least in historical linguistics, is described as an Indo-European tradition, which has, in many ways, a great emphasis on the advantage of speech over writing. And this is in Rig Veda. It was amazing to read that, for someone who does not have a depth of knowledge in that subject. And when you read it and you realize how much of it is dedicated to the glorification of breath, it's cosmic, it's divine, it's really about that kind of ability to breathe, and by implication, the ability to think through speech without ever touching writing. And this is also quite clear if you read this little story that's, I guess, brought to prominence by people like Derrida recently in Plato, in Phaedrus, when he related the story that the invention of writing is actually an invention to somehow discover a method of reminding. So writing kind of created this kind of disembodied experience and externalized wisdom and knowledge so that someone else, students, can then, so to speak, fake it through reading, and it never entered into the body. So it's really very much in speech that real knowledge resides. The form of writing that I think it's associated with that particular intellectual tradition, of course, is the alphabet. And the alphabet is not an image, but a way of recording sound, and it's kind of by nature very abstract. It's a great successful story, and it's if you look at this is really taken from a diagram from this incredible historical linguist, David Anthony, and talking about how describing the the spread of the Indo-European languages, basically from the Baltic to Southern European and to Iran and India and to all the way to the edge of China in Tarim Basin with the Tocharian variety or daughter language of the mother tongue of what's kind of described and reconstructed as the Proto-Indo-European. You could actually reconstruct, I think there are about 400 words, or like quite a number of words that have been reconstructed, and you can actually tell a story with the Proto-Indo-European, although nobody actually is certain that this language existed in that particular form. So this is all fascinating. It really shows that there's a map that shows how widely Indo-European languages have spread across the world, and the power of the alphabet, and the fact that I'm here speaking English, but having a background in exclusively in speaking and using Chinese, and it's a condition that in a way that's kind of comes with my background, and it's interesting to think about it. The question here is the alphabet inevitable? If you go through Western history or Western philosophy, it is clear that the mainstream great thinkers say that it is inevitable. You have it in Francis Bacon, who draws this parallel between hieroglyphics and letters and parables and arguments, so that in a way kind of hieroglyphics and parables, they were kind of earlier, more primitive stages of human thinking, and you have to move to letters and to argument. Hegel here stated quite clearly that the Chinese language is not made for science, because it lacks certain precision and so on and so forth. You can read that statement, this is quite amazing. German, it really goes on until today. Really, the last two quotations are from very recent scholars. Walter Ahn, the a renowned German theorist, who actually stated in his Orality and Literacy quite clearly that the Chinese characters will be replaced by Roman alphabet, and it's a matter of time. It will be a huge loss to literature, but it will be done. And this is actually also the opinion of William Hannes, and in this very interesting book, and then a couple of other books, and talking about Asia's orthographic dilemma, in the sense that it has entered into this kind of cumbersome way of structuring a cumbersome language, and that created a lot of burden and limited the ability to become creative. And this is a really incredible argument to say that for example, the Chinese language, and it's really using the Chinese language as preeminent example of Asian languages, and saying that the Chinese language is nothing but a flawed phonetic system, and it will be changed, it will be phoneticized, and to stay with this system of language is the reason for autocratic politics, and it's the reason for the Asians lacking creativity. So these are kind of extraordinary claims of the inevitability of the alphabet. It's really. So, are we looking at something that approaches to some kind of speech bias. And this is, of course, quite clearly one of the central themes of Derrida. If you kind of go through grammatology, it was precisely talking about that there is a phonocentrism, and it's really creating a whole series of philosophical, moral, aesthetic judgments that's based on language as speech sound, not as writing. And he wanted to say, you know, of course, in support of his deconstruction, that speech is just as problematic as writing. And but I think the interest in deconstruction really didn't take this kind of thesis further enough, and this is really what I'm quite struck by, that the existence or the tradition of phonocentric philosophy creates not only just a language, a kind of philosophy, a form of philosophy, but it's, to me, it's distinctive intellectual path. It really, this is a bit of a scary slide, and I don't know how to really go through it without having a whole semester's time to unpack it. But I want to make a claim here first, that it is really a distinctive intellectual path that leads you first to renunciation. Then it comes with, you know, asceticism and sacred space and practices of sainthood and all that. And second, in the act of reduction from polytheism to monotheism to monastic practices and to monasteries. Third, to imprint, which is really utopia. So there's a very quick process of reduction and imprint that's taking place. I'll come back to it later. But I want to say that what were the choices at the time when there was a great divide between sound and image? And this is really interesting that you look at, I mean, there's no doubt that Indo-European languages are the dominant language family in the world. It's 70.72%. The Sino-Tibetan language family is not doing too badly. It's got like a fifth of the world's population speaking it. If you count Chinese, actually Mandarin is the biggest language, the largest language in the world. But if you count the language families, I would say that the Indo-European languages are very, very, very successful. So what are we looking at here? That if you look further back enough to, you know, 4,000 to 1000 BCE, and you realize that there were actually two very distinct directions of language making, sound and image, here represented by hieroglyphics of the Anatolian variety, of the Egyptian variety, and the Mayan variety. Of course, there's the Chinese language. So in this hieroglyphics tradition, the language is image tradition, you have certain kind of features as the language being presented not as pure sound, but as object images, as this is obvious. It's a visual depiction. It's always a combination of phonetic and phonetic symbols and object images. So it's interesting that Western archaeologists and linguists always value very highly that moment of cracking the phonetic code. You know, this is really in the story. If you look at read the story about Jean-Francois Champollion or David Stewart, and Champollion decoded the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and David Stewart was famously the decoder of Mayan script, these were depicted as the ultimate moment of mastering that language. But I want to argue that these were a product of phono-centric aesthetic emphasis, that far from understanding the language, you've only made one important step towards understanding that language. The second point in relation to hieroglyphics is that there's a script hierarchy. I was quite struck by this because if we look at Anatolian hieroglyphics that have 500 of them, you realize that they're actually mostly used in monumental buildings and situations and carved on mountains and so on. This is, I don't want to kind of labor too much on this point, but just show you one example of a king's seal, which is made of two forms of script. One is the cuneiform, which is really the ring, the outer ring, and the second is actually the central hieroglyphics of the king. So they're actually description. Cuneiform was created because it was easy to write. You know, it's this kind of, you use the stylus and making triangular wedged impressions on wet clay, and that gives you a very rapid way of writing. So it was really created as a convenience tool, if you like. But in this particular case, the centrality of the object image and its association with the authority of the king remained as a very good indication of the script hierarchy, you know, what's important and what's not. And it's similarly in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and you see that there are other forms of making writing easier, hieratic and demotic forms of writing. But to me, in my mind, there's actually no doubt that hieroglyphics were the most important object images come language. If you look at the inscriptions and, you know, Book of the Dead or, you know, tombs and whatever, and the king's names are presented particularly framed as a cartouches, and what's really contained in these writings is phonetic, yes, you know, although we are not exactly sure how to pronounce it, and, you know, we think it's pronounced as Ramesses, but maybe not. But I think the image of the things is contained in hieroglyphics is very, very important. I think that's something that needs a much greater study. The third point about hieroglyphics is that the Chinese writing has the advantage of hieroglyphics and cuneiform. In a way, it is kind of a reformed, adapted cuneiform that's kind of integrated or incorporated into a method of writing, which is the use of the brush. There's some statistics about, you know, how many Chinese characters and so on, but that could be very much the reason why the Chinese language, actually the Chinese writing system, had such a long history and had a sustained use. Maybe there are other factors of, you know, geographical isolation and so on, but this is interesting to think about, that it really survived. With this script, the script hierarchy, although Chinese does not really have subscript, you know, it's just one, but it actually has a kind of greater prestige if you think about it. You know, if you think about a situation like this, that in a Roman building, the words would have been combined with the architecture. You know, it's really set into the stone. But here it is separated. You know, it's as if like it has a different order. It has really a separate layer. And it is everywhere. It's like carvings like this, of course, not seen as graffitis. They are actually quite important to the cultural landscape of so many places when you visit China. Forms of amusement, I'm sure you've seen this if you visit any parks in China, that this man with very good skill just uses water in a bucket and a sponge brush to write characters on the pavement. It's quite an interesting thing to watch. So there's a kind of almost like, this is like the Picasso moment, when he was looking at this, is to me, this is really like painting as writing. This is something that has, I cannot emphasize this more, enormous cultural investment. I think in some way William Hannes was right that the Chinese has invested so much culturally into the script that you have to take it very, very seriously. I want to show you, and just take a look at this calligraphy, which is just about the most famous piece of calligraphy. If you learn to do calligraphy in Chinese characters, it's a 4th century calligraphy, which is used as the consummate example. The Chinese artist Qiu Zhijie decided that he wanted to copy. You actually, it's like learning how to paint. You actually copy from a book. If you want to learn calligraphy, you copy from an example like this. So he did this performance piece over many years to copy this piece of calligraphy 1,000 times, literally 1,000 times, on the same piece of paper. Each time he shifts the script a little bit, so that by 50th time, you basically have a black sheet of paper. So you just went on and on and on. I thought it was quite a provocative piece in the sense that you actually not only kind of displaying that kind of hardship and cultural investment in the skill of calligraphy, but you also kind of end up with a black piece of, who knows what. It's like, that's the black at the end after 1,000 times. This is an even more intriguing piece that tackles the heavy cultural investment in the Chinese culture. It's a piece by a Chinese artist, Xu Bing, whose work I showed you earlier, called Book from the Sky. And I think this is really the best work that he's produced. That he actually spent 4 years creating a set of fake Chinese characters, but he did it with such dedication that these characters look so real. Not only that, and he actually made books out of them. So he made volumes of literature and volumes of medicine book, and it's just, he mimicked that form of those publications, but not a single word can be read. So it's like a ghost of the Chinese writing system, which produced a great shock to the cultural establishment. And he actually had to leave China because of this piece of work, and because it was just struck so deeply in the whole cultural edifice of the writing system. He had a lot of criticism, but it's quite a brilliant dedication. He was saying that I very seriously labored for years on something that says nothing. We'll just quickly show you the phonetic kind of equivalent of a Dada poem that's kind of plays with the idea of having sound but then no meaning. The second part of what I want to talk about is not just the Chinese language, but its subsystems. So I want to use, for lack of a better word, the word figuration to talk about that. And it's really how the same instinct, same kind of power that created the Chinese characters begins to create not only object images, but also to modify object things. That's the empire, the figure that I want to talk about. Some silly diagrams. I don't know. I think if I could actually kind of, visually present the difference between phonograms and logograms. Phonograms being, the Indo-European languages using sound as way of capturing language and objects in the world, but figuration, logograms as a different way of using object images to capture the physical world. And there seems to be two different processes. One I describe as mimesis, which is very, you can relate that to the Renaissance of following Western tradition art and science, but the Chinese process is what I would like to call figuration. It really is a understanding that's filtered through a whole set of modified object things, object images, and Chinese characters, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So how does seems to me that this modification is quite important. And so how does it happen? I think maybe the key is to look at the literary gardens that still exist, and you can visit in Suzhou and so on. They're really beautiful places and absolutely fantastic as environment that's created by literati. Traditionally, I think what really is amazing here is that each piece, it doesn't matter whether it's flowing, it's water, rock, tree, pavilion, is created as some kind of curated objects of value. They are selected because they look, they present certain object images that are closer to writing. It goes back to my point earlier about writing being behind the object creation. So you have that. It's really, this, you can put this in the context of cabinet of curiosities in the Western tradition, in which objects are collected either because of their use value or because of the potential to create knowledge. But there's nothing like that here. It's actually, these objects are here because they look like the thing that they are supposed to represent, and it's a form of writing. So coming back to this image, and you look at this constructed corner of a garden, they're modified pieces. This are quite common. So the modification does not come easy, and it is really, if you compare this to the topiaries in the Western gardening tradition, you see that the modification here is very slow. It's almost like Qiu Zhijie's copying of Lanting Xu for 1,000 times. This is really a slow, I would like to call it a slow violence, and the quick violence would be what you find in the topiaries in Western gardens. So, again, this is a bit of a jump, but if you look at something like this, this is actually a central business district in Hangzhou. What do we see? They could be something, some of this are done by Western architects, and most of them are Chinese architects, that they're actually figurated forms. If you think that the force of figuration is kind of creating modification to object things, it is then in some ways embodied in this design and construction process, that these are created as object images as well as buildings. And object images then begin to speak certain semantic content. And it is really this semantic content that demands its own distribution. And this is quite interesting. Again, going back to the literati gardens, of course, typically you go through Chinese literati gardens, you can experience them as just gardens, like watered plants and so on. But they actually have a lot of text in them. It's endless, it's just endless readings. If you don't really have access to this text, you don't really get it. There's a lot of kind of literary device literary devices that are embedded in this garden-making tradition. They can be anecdotes. If you don't read this, you have no idea. And there's actually space-time dislocation, and this, of course, takes time to unpack, but it's possible to do this study. And also metaphors and so on and so forth, a lot of that. And in some ways, and let's just show you some images of how much writing plays a role. And if you think about the rest as a kind of derivatives of writing, and you really think that these are kind of as much written objects as they are gardens. I'm showing you three ways of representing the garden. The 16th century traditional way was, this is actually drawings of the same garden. 16th century, you look at something like a poem, kind of a poetic capturing of the spirit of that garden, of certain parts of that garden. The garden is called Zhuozhengyuan, by the way. And it's interesting that with the influence of Western drawing method in the 20th century, you can see that China has been producing drawings very much like the center one, which is really based on orthographic projection, which I thought is a very difficult way to capture the Chinese garden, because it's taken the texts out of the whole, it's taken writing out of the whole picture. So the third one is actually what I try to somewhat invent and to combine, that there's some kind of precision, but also to remain committed to the role of writing in Chinese gardens. Perhaps, there are ways of trying, ways of even in the representation of these Chinese gardens, and one could capture the importance of text. So outside the literati tradition, if you look at the commercial culture, you find a version which is fundamentally connected to the same tradition, but then it just kind of has a popular manifestation of pasting endlessly, writing on buildings. What is important, architecture or writing? So in a way, I think because of this prominence of writing in not only in garden, in on buildings, and in Chinese cities, I would like to talk about a third aspect of the Chinese writing. I have time okay? Yeah. Okay. Which is what I would like to call the power function, because writings are not just writings, and when they're used in a particular way, they're actually they are anchors of power. So if you think about in Forbidden City, the most important building, which is the Hall of the Supreme Harmony, and you look at it and it's a building, but then you look at it, it's actually a piece of writing. The building is almost like just the backdrop of that three characters that you see so prominently. You can see that in 20th century Chinese Revolution, when writing are displayed so prominently in Tiananmen Square for whatever purposes, is really the writing that really does the job. And thinking about how Mao's calligraphy throughout 20th century became such a powerful symbol of his status. And this is actually Mao's calligraphy. It is really, so writing calligraphy acquires not just the symbolic power of an office, but the power of the object of writing as calligraphy. This is kind of amusing to me, and I was traveling around in China and then ran into a small city which wanted to kind of present itself as a grand, important city, so build itself a huge city hall, and then put on all these writings, to indicate that, they have important institutions inside and so on. It's actually, this is quite common in China. I just find this particularly interesting as an example. So if you look at the Forbidden City, perhaps you can begin to imagine that it is not just architecture, but the system of object things and object images and writing that begins to shape that power. And stepping back and look at, even 20th century construction, look at Shanghai, maybe these things are also object things. They have a particular significance in terms of who designed it, how tall it is, and what shape it is, and so on, in that writing system. So it has a very different way of creating value to these objects. Very quickly, I want to mention the last feature of the Chinese writing system, or the figuration in relation to the Chinese writing system with regard to heritage. And the Chinese heritage is, particularly building heritage in cities, is always a subject when I talk to people about Chinese cities. They never keep anything, they always demolish everything and so on. What I want to argue here is that there's actually different memory strategy because of this writing system that's really focused on text, writing, that memory is in writing rather than in things, rather than in relics. So I could describe what happens in the West, which is really keeping everything, whatever that Venice Charter promotes, as a kind of pilgrimage, like kind of fetish of the relic, that you really keep it, and that the things are actually what holds memory. Maybe in the Chinese context, the memory is not necessarily always in things, but they're also in text. So I want to show you an example of a 12th century text that was discovered in early 20th century. And this is actually a very kind of stable Chinese tradition called 考证. It's like kind of making the right text. So it was, this text is the 12th century text was lost. But one fine day, one politician was really interested in architecture by the name of Zhu Qiqian. He found a 16th century copy of that text. So he was really excited, let's publish it and so on. And then he realized that, oh no, this text is really bad quality. What do we do? So he then found, so you've noticed that the 16th century, he found the 12th century edition, just one single page, one page, in a kind of fragment, in the library. So that gave him the idea of recreating the whole text from the copy of the 16th century back to the 12th century original, which then he published in 1925 as the one on the far right on the screen. So you see that really, the 1925 was at least seen at the time to be the authentic original of the 12th century text. It's a fascinating story of how the 16th century text and then was kind of refined and improved. You see the difference in drawing style through copying and made into a new edition. Not only that, and he added, new pages and new diagrams, and the book was bound in a traditional form, and it's great. It's actually a beautiful, beautiful publication, except that it is a fake original in the Western sense. So in some ways, at least in his mind, that this was the original, because the text are correct. It's a new edition. It is really, it was really a labor of love on his part to create this new original. So what does that mean? If you look at some buildings, in terms of kind of keeping tradition and heritage preservation. And this is really interesting case. And there was a tower along the Yangtze River called Yellow Crane Tower. It kind of was built in the 3rd century as a legend. And the last surviving example was the one in the middle. There were some painting representations of that pavilion in the past, but the last surviving one was the one in the middle, which is a 19th century a recreation of an old legend. And it was destroyed by fire. And in 1985, a new one came up. It was really kind of similar looking, but not quite the same. And the original had 3 floors, and now this has 5. The original is timber construction, this is concrete, and it has air conditioning, it has a lift, but it really, if I just look at people who visited this place, it's not troubling. It's a memory that's as stable as anything else. So where does the stability of the memory come from? I really think that it's the poems that have been written around that pavilion that gave it credibility. There are many of them. This is Mao and Li Bai, and this is quite a cultural icon, but the iconicity then is not rested or rooted in the materiality of the building, but more like in the writing, which often escape the scholars from the West, because automatically one would look at and disturbed by the nature of its fakeness. But perhaps it's not exactly how it works in this particular context. You find that a lot, I worked in Hong Kong for a long time, and this is just one particular example of Central Pier in Hong Kong, which, used to be, Edwardian building in 1912, and then it was changed to a modernist building, and then in 2006 there was really recreation of that Edwardian building, not with very loose connection with the original. It's really kind of a more like a improvisation of the idea of Edwardian building. And it was also moved 350 meters away from the original site. So if you see further jotted out in that pier is the recreated, improvised Edwardian building, but the original site is here, as you can see in that 1950s modernist building. And it had to be done like this because there's a highway construction running through the site. So it's very interesting. So if you look at, Hong Kong over, say, like 80 years' time, that's actually a very similar view of Central from the peak. They look very different, but in some ways, there's a different kind of memory that's, if you just think about the examples I showed you with details, and there's a different kind of memory that's embodied in all this. Although the building forms are so dramatically different. The last point, which is really what I want to take from everything I just described, and what does all this mean? I would like to maybe propose the idea of material orders. Material orders, not so much, remember we talked about the kind of quick movement of the intellectualization from object things to what I would like to call here as final orders, which is, you can describe them as utopias. That really kind of short-circuiting of things and utopia, and perhaps should be really mediated with something that's intermediate, that resembles an intermediate orders between the first and the final order, whatever the final order is. It could be science, it could be God, and it could be truth and justice and so on. And that intermediate order, in my mind, could be connected to what we're talking about today, which is really about the role of the object image and character, and that intermediate order therefore has a better chance to match planetary ecology, if you like. This is probably our current crisis, that we build too many utopias and they don't really match what's going on in the world. We want to improve the world, which is really probably a bit of a hubris to think in that way. So I want to call or describe what we talked about as proto-material orders, and really having another chance, after Hegel, after Francis Bacon, to think about the act of naming, thinking, and speaking, and really as a real concrete counter-proposal to phonocentrism. There are some really brilliant people who work in sinology, or used to work, and Marcel Grenet, who worked in 1930s, did talk about, my take on their work in relation to intermediate orders. Marcel Grenet, it's a very interesting sinologist, French sinologist, who actually talked about the idea of immanence in Chinese thought, in the sense that justification is not kind of derived from the final order, but rather from the intermediate order. Like when you want to convince someone, you would say water flows from upper location to the lower location. It's immanence. It's the idea is in the body of things, and which was really something that Hegel attacked vehemently. That this is really an immature form of thinking. So I want to have a chance to rethink that, and also Marcel Grenet, who probably hated Catholicism, really was fascinated by the idea of having neither God nor law. And God, law, of course, they are kind of symbolic of the final order that we just talked about, but more like seeking morality and truth in the Confucian philosophy. And very interesting, but that was half a century ago. And Francois Jullien is currently working on one of the most interesting sinologists, going much further with ideas of, say, propensity. What are the orders? How do the orders work? And he was using ideas of propensity, detour and axis, and the idea of efficacy rather than cause and effect. It's really, it's a different way of looking at how things function with a different set of ideas. There, of course, this is just a kind of catch-all slide, and of course, all kinds of critiques of the phono-centric Indo-European tradition of the intellectual path, and going back to John Webb, and who, beside being the son-in-law of Inigo Jones and an architect of certain buildings, he actually wrote a really amusing dissertation on the Chinese language being the original language of Noah, and it's a kind of sinological novelty, and it's quite interesting to read. But I think Leibniz was more serious about really looking for a true character, although he said that the Chinese may not be that true character, but he was really looking for it, and Chinese may be a way of getting there. It's really getting to the point where you have a closer relationship between character and thing, rather than having a sign, an idea, and a thing, like having 3 steps rather than 2, which is embedded in the phonetic languages. I want to also quickly mention that Robert Hooke was a particularly interesting character when I was looking at the Royal Society in 17th century. And I realized that there was a huge feud between Hooke and Newton. And it was really very important for Hooke to regard empirical evidence as, in a way, the intermediate cause of things, rather than quickly going from the first cause, which is, how things work, to the final cause, which is really scientific propositions, universal. And this is really what Newton was very interested in, jumping too quickly. So there was empiricism, not science, that was at work. So I thought that was really a very important critique of the Indo-European intellectual path. And there is in Freud and Lacan in this very important sentence, I guess very well known, which is like the unconscious being structured like language. But my kind of suggestion or speculation is that language is not phonetic. And it is perhaps a way for us to understand that there was a purge of the figure in phonocentrism. It's really it's really exactly like what you see in Hegel and Water On in William Hannes, that kind of dismissal of the figure in speech and that comes back as a language of the unconscious that works very differently. The Heideggerian tradition of looking at objects, things, Heidegger, if you believe in that, and was influenced deeply by Eastern philosophy and was trying to think anew the Western intellectual tradition, and that has been certainly picked up by people like Bruno Latour, Grant Harmon, who wanted to return to things, and rather than to kind of stay with endless abstraction and utopianism. In the end, perhaps this is really a critique of utopia. Utopia as realistic, but ultimately not real, and this is quite interesting to reflect on. And material orders are perhaps not necessarily more realistic, and probably even less realistic in appearance, but more real as a network. The critique also extends to the typical tripartite structure of utopia, dystopia, and heterotopia, which dominate. It appears a lot in our discourses in architecture. And this is the final slide. I want also argue that there is a possibility of a moral and aesthetic ground in the intermediate orders as material orders, rather than endlessly going back to the cycle of renunciation, reduction, imprint. And this requires perhaps new empiricism, and I think that would be a great thing to have, and perhaps a new way of looking at perhaps the second most popular linguistic system and see what they can give us in terms of a different way of thinking about the world and mapping the world and ordering the world, and perhaps we are not so invested and in a almost unthinking way in all kinds of utopias, and particularly today the technological utopia in relation to data. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Do we have a...
Yeah.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions? There's a question there.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It's very intriguing to me. I'm Chinese. I just have a question I want to ask. I was wondering, you kind of addressed the logic of material order towards the end. I was wondering, could you explain a little bit more how you see the relationship between this logic and like the current dominating economic force in city making? In contemporary city making in China?
Right. I think in a way there's a form of capitalism which now you can describe as a multinational finance, perhaps, that's producing a lot of the buildings that are in cities. But that particular form of capitalism does not have to be always the same. And it's interesting that my friend and a colleague of some variety. Scott Lash, who recently, together with Michael Keith and two other scholars, produced a book called China Constructing Capitalism. It is very interesting to think about a different kind of capitalism. You may not even want to describe it as capitalism, but a different kind of financing system that doesn't work as a money utopia. The current model is that the capital is driving all the development process. It is really designed to produce the best, highest profit. That really is a very simplistic construction of capitalism, and this is something that even Adam Smith was having doubts whether that could be the viable way for the future. Of course, Adam Smith was thinking about the Dutch capitalism in the 17th century, when instead of kind of working on the economy of things, and it became the financing structure of stock markets and chasing the shadow of money that does not have a ground. So that really is something that we can rethink, that should we actually turn capitalism and money back to the things, and that could be indeed one of the material orders that you can begin to rewrite the rules of capitalism and therefore really begin to produce a different kind of city, and not as a result of money utopia, but as a result of a different material order that has money as one of the components. And we probably have to do this because the speed with which we're destroying our environment is certainly an alarm call for us to rethink that.
Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. I spent a couple of years in Hong Kong, so I'm a little bit familiar with the city, but I wanted to ask you a slightly different question, which is related to the rise of the museums in China and the buildings very much related to speculation in real estate.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you have something to say about the museum, or the sort of prefiguring of the museum before that happened. Because from what I understand, there's a word, a kind of archaic word in Chinese, where the closest to the idea of the museum is encyclopedia. Can you say something more about that?
That's very interesting. Thank you for making that link. I'm not sure whether I can go immediately to, making a parallel. It's really a very, very fascinating idea. Maybe there's some middle stages where that actually happened when museums, those museums, most of them don't really have a lot of great content. The museums are actually there to, I would argue, write the appearance of culture as some kind of component. There must be a list of things. A museum is just one of them. And that really is a composition of figures that then begin to gain, or at least in the minds of buyers and sellers, credibility of a place. What would be the place without museums? So that really is how I would see it, at least immediately.
Thank you. So I just want to start with an impression. I think your presentation appears to me a little bit you're like a Renaissance thinker, a little bit the way Foucault in The Order of Things introduces Borges' rehearsal of a Chinese classification, and I think your lecture has qualities of that. But I want to challenge you on a number of things I think making claims which I find hard to sustain. And there's a number of contradictions. So first of all, I think you tying too closely together Indo-European languages versus Sino-Tibetan languages, and then equate that with phonetic writing versus hieroglyphic writing, as if the language is so closely tied in with writing systems. And our writing systems go back quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I think there is, I would say, universal agreement among linguists that writing systems are secondary and derivative. Particularly, and the reason why we have to say this is because those who were the literati were an absolute minute minority in society, which then we would have to argue that they would, from that nucleus, you would kind of really impact back on language, which I'm not saying that there isn't an impact, but there's definitely a primacy of speech over writing systems and languages, and even also in the Indo-European, of course, there's an absolute minority of those who were actually writing and reading, and that couldn't have been a huge imprint. I think your whole idea of a kind of Indo-European intellectual path based on phonetic writing versus hieroglyphic writing, I think, is questionable. A huge claim, and I think unsustainable. Yeah. But I want to pick up another point is when you come in with the phonocentrism critique of Derrida. It's very interesting. I'm subscribing to this, and it's. I don't think that you use Derrida's phonocentrism critique to kind of back up some kind of notion of, and you have to, without much telling us, where there's a certain advantage or superiority or otherness in terms of hieroglyphic writing versus alphabetic writing. He's not making that distinction. He is, for him, writing. Is emphasizing the importance of writing, and not as something which you can't think of derivative of speech when it comes to systematic theoretical thought, when it comes to philosophy. That's where this applies. In everyday language, we don't need writing. It's not, that relationship isn't. Phonocentrism is perfectly the correct message, but when it comes to philosophy and its reflection, it becomes clear, of course, that a philosophical tradition and also the elaborateness of a philosophical thought of an oeuvre like Hegel's, for instance, is absolutely unthinkable in terms of depth and structuration and the crafting of a terminology without the aid of writing. Then you see that writing cannot be a superficial add-on where you just illustrate and communicate your thought. That thought has been elaborated through writing, and that's the point. But this has nothing to do with the distinction between hieroglyphic and Chinese writing versus phonetic writing. This is perfectly viable with phonetic writing, that this new dimension of thinking comes into being, and that's Luhmann is somebody who's also emphasizing a lot, and that is not only an elaboration of a single text, but after printing, the possibility of distributing text and critiquing text and having textual references and critique and weeding out inconsistencies across texts and building up an edifice. Writing is absolutely critical, absolutely crucial. So we're living in a literary and then print-based Gutenberg kind of civilization, which makes certain intellectual achievements possible. And again, I think that is a point worth making, but I think that has very, very little to do with, I mean, this is phonetic writing as much as let's say, Chinese script. There's no difference in that, on that point.
I mean, just before I hand it back to you, I mean, on the critique of phonocentrism, I mean, I think that there is a point which Patrick's remarks tap into, which in a sense is that Derrida's critique of phonocentrism is always to point out, ultimately it's not really a critique, it's just to say it's wrong. And that underneath it, so, I mean, Derrida puts very polemically his totally counterintuitive proposition that writing comes before speech. And I suppose on that, anti-phonocentric basis,
but only in philosophy.
Well, only in philosophy, perhaps. But nonetheless, the question to ask is, what's writing? I mean, because it's clear that Derrida's kind of écriture is not writing in a kind of sense of comparative systems. Mm-hmm. You know, it's indifferent, it seems to me, between most aspects that I would know about Chinese and the phonocentrism part of Western is like a small subset of issues. I mean, certainly Saussure is furious with the lack of phonocentrism. I mean, his whole angry chapter on spelling in the Cours, is astonishing. So I guess it's whether, I mean, the two terms that I had problems with still is on the one hand writing, and on the other hand it seemed to me to some extent the problem with the term figure. Which also, I mean, in art schools and in architecture schools, people totally forget or didn't know that these terms come from rhetoric. And that, a figure always has to be kind of located in its rhetorical function, which I think serves your argument very well.
That's true.
Oh, I have this.
Oh, sorry.
Well, wow, where to begin? I think for whatever the problems and opportunities of the word figure, it's certainly very central to everything I talk about. And I mentioned Derrida, but then I had to leave him very quickly because I realized that he could not help anymore beyond the idea of phonocentrism. Therefore, I really put quite a lot of emphasis on the figuration, and in the sense that the figure has some kind of ontological status. I also want to talk about the figure through the Chinese language as one of the living languages of object images, essentially. I think it's really not so much in the construct of philosophy, but more like kind of taking a step back and think in a way that my attempt to approximate what the Chinese is doing in English. That's really a hard task to do, but I think a figure probably has some promise to basically expand the literati, the elitist concern with writing or not, to a whole series of form-making, space-creating steps that then in the end, faintly you can actually read them as written text. And I don't know how to answer your question of all languages are pretty much similar, and I think they're really radically different, and my own experience of getting to know a different language.
My point was, these languages might be different, but the difference doesn't reside in the writing system, which is a secondary formation. So that's where because in the way you talk about it, it means that the writing system has an enormous formative power over the language itself. And I just wonder what the mechanism is. If only a very, very small elite is actually writing, and it's relatively late in the critical language formation stages.
I mean, to that I can only say that if you begin to learn how to do calligraphy and you begin to realize that what kind of power that has, as what's demonstrated by the Chinese artists, and the written Chinese characters is always been the major theme, and then I picked out two. I thought these two are most provocative. It takes a Chinese.
You have illiteracy in 19th century across all of China
Yeah.
and in Europe. So,
But the idea
language.
of an elite affecting, the language as such can't be particularly novel. I mean, if you think of English,
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, a very small literate elite between 1400 and 1600 completely like re-Latinized English, sort of gave us Shakespeare, which was altogether different from Chaucer,
Yeah.
whereas the same difference doesn't apply in Italian.
Yeah.
But it was certainly an elite.
But you know where I'm coming from. Your thesis depends on such mechanisms
Yeah. Yeah.
being very, very deep.
But I think figure and figuration is more important than that immediate claim that you're having problem with.
We doubtedly could go on forever. And with Patrick here, even longer than that. But thank you very much for coming. And thank you very much for a very, very nice lecture. And can I say, those who are around tomorrow morning are welcome to come to the seminar at 10:30 in the PhD room, which is, to use a very architectural expression, at the back somewhere. Okay, thanks.